And thank you for attending this evening's public lecture titled Ukraine, Financial Perspectives on Economic Sanctions. And I'd like to open by expressing Bangalore University's support for the people of Ukraine. Bangalore University stands for liberal values, human rights, and the right to critical inquiry. As such, there are a number of events taking place throughout the university aimed at shining a spotlight on events that are happening in Ukraine. For example, Bangalore University is currently working on introducing scholarships for Ukrainian refugees, working with CARA, the Council for At-Risk Academics, to support Ukrainian academics, and engaged in discussions with the Welsh Government regarding accommodation for Ukrainian refugees. So tonight's public lecture gives us the opportunity to hear from two experts regarding the purpose and the likely effects of economic sanctions on Ukraine. It's also an opportunity for me to welcome two friends of the Bangalore Business School back onto our campus. Let me introduce both of our experts to you. Firstly, I'm very pleased to introduce Simon Thompson. Simon Thompson was appointed as the Chief Executive of the Chartered Bankers Institute in 2007 after working for the Association of Chartered Certified Accountants in Central and Eastern Europe and for the International Federation of Accountants. Under his leadership, the Institute has grown to become the largest professional body for bankers in the UK, with nearly 35,000 members and students in more than 100 countries. So welcome, Simon. I'm also very pleased to introduce Alex Sanchez. Alex serves as the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Florida Bankers Association, the FBA. Founded in 1888 and located in Tallahassee, the FBA is a leading voice for Florida's banking industry. Alex's responsibilities including representing and advocating for Florida's banking industry before all legislative and regulative bodies in Tallahassee and in Washington. And welcome, Alex.
Thank you.
Our MC for tonight is Professor Stephen Jones. Stephen Jones is Director of Business Relations for the Bangalore Business School and is responsible for the school's links with businesses in North Wales. Stephen is also a senior lecturer and teaches on our undergraduate, postgraduate and executive education programs. So please join me once again in welcoming Simon, Alex and Stephen for tonight's discussions.
Noswaith, good evening. And croeso I chi gyd. Welcome to you all, whether you're in the room here or you're joining us online. I can promise you an action-packed event, which, as with the best of all things, it hasn't been overly planned. So quite how it's going to go, one never knows. There's a sign here that says, "Quiet please, exams in progress." So there will be coursework set at the end here, and it will count towards your grade. But seriously, if you could turn your phones to silent, then that would be beneficial, so there's no distraction when people listen to it on the recording later. Before we do get into the topic, Alex, as part of this long relationship that Bruce has just referred to, Alex wants to call Andrew Edwards up and Simon to give them a small memento of that relationship. So as they say in all the best game shows, come on down, Andrew, come on down.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Steve. Thank you. Andrew, I want to thank you for inviting Patsy and me back to this great university, which we love very dearly. And just a small gift from us to you, which we hope you cherish from years to come. And Simon, thank you for your long-time friendship as well. And here's a little gift that we want to thank you as well for the relationship we've had for very long. So thanks so much.
Thank you. That's so kind.
Thank you
very much, Alex. Tom.
Does it need to be on green?
Yeah.
Okay.
There we go. Hope you like this.
There we are, just checking on the microphones from the speakers. At the moment, you can't mute me, so you'll just have to listen to what we're trying to do today. As Bruce said, we're very much in sympathy with the people of Ukraine, and we wanted to take this opportunity of both our visitors being here to have a look at the finance perspectives, much in the news at the moment with regard to what impact can economic sanctions have on the terrible pictures that we see on the news. I'd just like to set the scene, to spend a couple of minutes talking so that we have a common set of understanding as to what sanctions are about and what they can and perhaps can't achieve. From the slide that you see in front of you at the moment, sanctions as defined by the United Nations Security Council are intended to apply pressure to a state or to an entity to comply with objectives. You can read the rest for yourself, but there are multiple objectives, and the idea is to get people, to get organisations, to get governments to comply without the use of force. Very much in the news at the moment in terms of a no-fly zone. This is the United Nations Security Council's view, and you'll see that since 1966, so a period of some 56 years, there have only been 30 sanction regimes applied. There are some of the countries. And part of the challenge, of course, is getting consensus and getting everybody to agree to apply these sanctions. Hence, the relatively few, it may seem, sanctions. The next slide, please. So, I just want to briefly to say the history of sanctions. It's nothing new. Allegedly, it started in 432 BC, when the Athenian Empire banned its neighbouring state, Megara, from its marketplaces. In the context of what economic sanctions may or may not be able to achieve, I thought it was interesting to read what President Woodrow Wilson said in 1919. Before the United Nations was formed, when it was the League of Nations, a nation that is boycotted is a nation that is in sight of surrender. Apply this economic, peaceful, silent and deadly remedy, and there will be no need for force. Unfortunately, of course, that isn't how it's seen at the moment. That's not what we're managing to achieve at the moment. The reality, as Carter Ruck says, global, comprehensive and vigorously enforced sanctions often have produced limited and tenuous results. It's a difficult challenge, particularly in an integrated international economy, and sometimes military force is required. The next slide, please. But sanctions do not just operate in a vacuum. They do not succeed or fall in a vacuum on their own. And the United Nations talks about part of a comprehensive strategy: peacekeeping, peace building and peacemaking. Unfortunately, many of the sanctions that we hear about on our news are not united. They are by individual nations or groups of nations, but not through the United Nations. The Council also says that it applies sanctions with an increasing recognition of the rights of those who are targeted, in the case of our example tonight, Russia. Next slide, please. I've chosen a few selected headlines just so we can observe the impact to date. For those who are living in Russia, IKEA to McDonald's are withdrawing. What the Western exodus means for Russians. Now, I'm sure that people in the Ukraine are not at all interested in Western capitalist icons withdrawing from Russia. But Russia also faces a brain drain, says one headline. Outside Russia, and perhaps impacting us listening here in the room and also online, there are rising prices of commodities for gas and wheat. Russia and the Ukraine together produce 30% of the world's global exports in wheat, and therefore we can expect that food prices may change. There's a chance of default on loans. President Putin has said that he's going to perhaps hold planes that are on lease hostage, not with passengers in. Tech platforms have been accused of being propaganda tools. And at the level of individual firms, Danone, the food manufacturer, has defended staying in Russia. Deutsche Bank, in the early stages of the war, actually said it was not going to exit and had to defend its position, and more recently has decided not to do any further business in Russia. And UniCredit has had to reassure its investors, no matter what happens, we'll still fulfill our dividend pledge. It goes to show the range of stakeholders who are potentially affected by economic sanctions. Over the weekend, I spoke to a friend who is the director of a business school in Latvia, just to get an insight to the Latvian perspective. and I share some of his words with you. In Latvia and the Baltics and Eastern Europe, we understand the Russian mindset. Russia understands power, military power, he said. And sanctions will help and are effective, but they take time and they need more countries and deeper sanctions. Oil, gas and coal purchases by Europe feed the military machine that we see pictures of in the Ukraine. He went on to say that those nations, he was referring to the population of Latvia, who of course previously were in the Soviet sphere, those of us who experienced that period of rule are more willing to shrink our national economies, to see our personal incomes fall, because if Russia cannot be stopped in Ukraine, then where next? Latvia, he says, have learnt the lessons of history and sought to try and reduce their dependency on Russia. Not an easy thing to do, as we're finding out ourselves. Having set the scene for our discussion, I want to open up the conversation with Simon and Alex by asking them, first of all, having painted a picture of what economic sanctions are about, their personal views, the views of their institutions with regard to the effectiveness of economic sanctions. Would you like to go first, Alex?
Yes. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you. And good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. This is a great discussion on a very difficult issue. And first of all, let me just say my heart goes out to the people of Ukraine. Obviously, in the 21st century, it's just totally unacceptable to have this invasion of a country militarily like Russia's doing. And secondly, let me say this about the ordinary, everyday Russian people. When these sanctions are imposed, and hopefully every country will jump in, at the end of the day, when the dust settles, it will be the Russian people who will, the everyday people, the people who may not even like Putin, who don't like this war, who are going to be the ones who are going to suffer. And you know, I say that on both sides there. The oligarchs and Mr. Putin and his cronies, obviously, they need to be sanctioned, and I think they are being done that. But I think sanctions will work, but only if the international community holds steadfast, firm, and hard. If the walls start crumbling on sanctions, and then it's not going to work. And there's plenty of examples around the world over the last 50 years where sanctions did not work because the rest of the world did not jump in. North Korea, South Africa, Cuba, so many examples of countries that had embargoes or sanctions, and those countries did not change. And what we all would like right now, obviously, is for a change in Russia, because Mr. Putin is setting them back quite a long ways, you know, because of his actions. But sanctions have done, you know, and Stephen is right, it's going to take time. The ruble is down about 13% since on the international market since February 24th. Freezing Russia's central bank reserves held globally is going to help. As of 6/21, the central bank of Russia had 16% of its reserves in US dollars assets and 32% in the euro. You know, we all know about the importance of the Russian oil and gas. Countries like Germany are going to have to hold, even if a peace agreement is reached tomorrow or tonight. Germany and countries like Germany who buy significant amounts of oil and gas from Russia are going to have to hold strong and firmly on these sanctions in order to really make a change fundamentally in Russia. There's a law in the United States, it's called the Foreign Direct Product Rule, which allows the United States to block exports to Russia of any product, including any foreign goods made with US goods. And the United States will pressure other countries that use US products and services to put in their own products and then export to Russia to block those exports. Now, where I think Russia is really going to feel these sanctions are in the financial area, as Stephen alluded to, but also in other areas as well. Russia's airplane fleet is made up, 80% of aircraft fleet in Russia are made up of Boeing or Airbus components. If they can't get spare parts, that's going to cripple their airline, and crippling an airline will cripple your economy because you don't have the movement of commerce in a vast country like Russia, or certainly internationally with those countries that may not abide by the sanctions. And then, you know, it's good to see Ford, Volkswagen, and Toyota, all with manufacturing plants in Russia, saying we're walking away. We're closing down these plants. And those are thousands of jobs that are held by everyday Russians that they will not have here. And that's going to hurt the economy. Of course, BP and ExxonMobil said they're also walking away from dealings. And a lot of the spare parts for the drilling industry and the exploration industry in Russia for oil and gas may come from Western parts as well. And if they can't get those parts, as Venezuela learned now in the last decade, it cripples their oil industry. They can't replace those parts with internal machinery. And Russia in particular is very vulnerable to high dependence of imports to keep their economy afloat. So the list of companies, Visa, MasterCard, Goldman, American Express, PayPal, FedEx, UPS, Apple, Samsung, Netflix, yes, McDonald's and Starbucks to a lesser extent, IKEA to a lesser extent, and Nike and H&M. But the tariffs will be felt. The sanctions will be felt in Russia, and it will cripple the Russian economy. But it's going to take time, and every country's got to hold true to this, including the International Monetary Fund. You know, blocking Russian banks from the SWIFT international banking system, which is basically a communication system that global worldwide banks use to communicate in the transfer of money. If you're excluded from that, that's going to hurt your ability to operate internationally, and that's going to hurt the two large Russian banks who have been excluded from that. So in summary, look, it's going to take time. Russia relies heavily on imports. 81% of the non-food sector in their economies of imports. That's really going to hurt the economy, but it also hurt where tens of thousands of Russians work at the KAMAZ Russian truck factory, which the prediction is that production will fall by 40%. Leaving as unemployed many Russian citizens from their. Mr. Putin, while their gold reserves are high, and they have done a good job in spending, not having deficit spending like many Western countries have had, including the United States. But these sanctions are going to sting, and they'll sting hard. But it's going to take time. And the Western countries and the world have to hold firmly for this to take place.
Thanks, Alex. Simon, your perspective, and also perhaps if you have anything to say about there are sanctions and there are choices that individual companies make, some of which you've heard. We'd be interested to hear your view.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. If I can build on some of Alex's points, maybe disagree with one. I think there is at least some evidence that sanctions were effective in South Africa, at least supported by other actions of consumer boycotts and things. So perhaps in the long term, sanctions can be effective. Probably the jury is still out whether they were effective in Athens in the 4th century BC. Maybe it's too early to tell, as the Chinese might say. I think there's some evidence that sanctions can have an effect in the medium term. If you look at Iran, for instance, where we've had a fairly comprehensive set of sanctions for the last decade or so. The country's certainly suffered multiple recessions, devaluations, very high inflation, and so on. But Iran is still there. It's still the same regime in place. Perhaps behaviours changing slightly, but very slowly. Clearly, those sanctions are not effective in the short term, and they're not going to change Russian behaviour. But I don't think what we're really seeing is sanctions so on against Russia. I think what we're seeing here is economic warfare, because that is the only way we can fight back. We being the G7, the G20. Stephen's absolutely right. These are not UN sanctions. They are sanctions applied by multiple jurisdictions, multiple countries. Hence the very complicated situation. It's the only response we have to Russia's kinetic warfare, which is that horrible term for basically bombing people and buildings. The sanctions, I think, I would divide them into 2 or 3 categories. Alex, you've given, I think, a great sort of précis of the sort of the technology sanctions against some of the companies. I think there's the high-profile sanctions against the oligarchs. You know, can we seize a yacht in wherever it might in the south of France, or if it's moored off Anglesey? Those are for public consumption. Those aren't going to change any behaviour meaningfully in any way whatsoever. But they make some nice headlines. The ones that matter are the sanctions against the Russian financial system, particularly the central bank. You mentioned of the $630 billion in foreign reserves, around $300 billion of that is frozen. It's the euro deposits and the euro reserves and the dollar reserves and so on. And of course, that is the money that Russia needs to finance its war. And I'm not a military expert, but from seeing what I see in the media and reading respected commentators about these things, Russia is clearly running out of military firepower in Ukraine. Our best reaction is to make sure it runs out of financial firepower too. So that's the economic warfare that we're engaged with. And one of the lessons of history is that except for the short, sharp campaigns, victory in any conflict usually goes to the side with the greatest financial firepower. Think of the Napoleonic Wars, think of World War I, World War II, the Cold War, and so that's what's really happening here. So does economic warfare work? Yes, it does, but it works slowly, I think. And Stephen, do you want me to pick up on the point around sort of companies and company behaviour as well?
Yeah, please.
Yes, I think it's something like 400 companies have now, 450, it goes up each day, have announced sort of various forms of withdrawal. It's quite hard to tell sometimes from the headlines as to exactly what this means. There's about, I think, 50 or 60 or so companies have said they're not going to withdraw for various reasons. I think there's a number of drivers. It's not just about ethics and corporate behaviour. I think there are some companies that are very much erring on the side of caution in terms of not wanting to fall foul of sanctions themselves. Yes, companies are aware of reputational risk, geopolitical risk, there's financial risk there being caught out. But I would point out many of the companies that have made the high-profile announcements are the ones perhaps with less skin in the game at the moment. So fantastic that McDonald's has withdrawn from Russia. But it's mostly a franchise operation there, isn't it? So actually, I think they're taking a 2% hit on their global revenues, whereas, say, some of the German retailers, where 10, 15, 20% of their global revenue comes from Russia, they haven't pulled out. And now they make an argument about, we're providing essential supplies. There may well be some things in supermarkets that are essential. Depending on your views, there may be many things in supermarkets that are essential, but others would simply say, well, look, there's no ethical comparison here between the sort of needs of people getting their 4 kinds of bread with sort of bombing hospitals and schools. There is no moral equivalence there, and those companies should get out. My personal view is that whether you come at this from an ethical perspective or whether you come at it from a risk perspective, there is very little case for Western companies being in Russia in the short term.
Thank you for that. That's a very succinct statement. There's very little case for them to be in Russia in the short term. Before I became an academic, I worked for an American high-tech company in Southeast Asia, and my manager used to regularly say to me, and it was in the days when before email and before mobile phones, so you can get a sense of what it is, every month he'd say, "Jones, what are you doing in such and such a country?" And he'd say, "Remember, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act." And I'd go, yes, Hank, I remember that. And when I moved with the same company to China, we had to license technology. So there have been controls for a long time, and individual companies to a greater or lesser extent comply with them. The next slide, please. So if it's not about economic sanctions, and companies make some choices, and these aren't universally applied, what might guide the behaviour of managers beyond legal penalties? ESG, environmental, social and governance standards, have been around for some time. They're not legal obligations, I don't think. This is from PricewaterhouseCoopers. There are other accountancy and consultancy firms. I just happened to take this one. There's the reference if you want to look at them. And it's about moving beyond just doing the legal minimum to have a think, as Simon was just saying, about ethical requirements. And of course, it moves beyond what we're willing to trade. It's about climate changes or scarcity, diversity and inclusiveness, safety, data security, etc. In the UK, Marks and Spencer's and to Vodafone, lots of companies have been saying, when these refugees come, we will offer them jobs. And the cynical may say, well, that's to do with their vested commercial interest. Nevertheless, it requires business communities, as my friend in Latvia said, to get involved and what was it, Simon? Get their skin in the action. Okay, so I'm now interested, in case you have another similarly interesting statement that you could make. What do you think in terms of guiding behaviour of managers? The next slide suggests, there it is, the UN Principles for Responsible Banking are voluntary principles, particularly for the banking sector. And the next slide talks about an educational and supervisory role. We'll come to that in a moment. But your first thoughts on how could we guide managers' behaviour beyond just legal penalties? Is there a role that we can play as educations, as professional institutions that both of you represent?
Well, I think we're getting into very dangerous territory if we start saying that managers should simply be, or any business people should be, simply guided by the law or very strict interpretations of fiduciary duty. I mean, even Milton Friedman sort of tempered his theories by saying that companies and managers needed to act in accordance with sort of civic norms and cultural norms and standards, as well as fiduciary duty and so on. The UN principles of responsible banking, I think, a really excellent set of principles. Linked to the broader pursuit of societal objectives, linked to the Paris Agreement and the UN Sustainable Development Goals and banking responsibly, being a responsible, purposeful member of society. But they're really principles aimed at directing the broad corporate strategy, the activities and operations of organisations, not the behaviour of individual managers. Although, of course, there's clearly a link between the organisational and the individual, and that's called culture. As well. So they can be helpful to an extent. On ESG, I think there's been a somewhat unhelpful distraction with some of these debates we've been having about whether ESG should have somehow prevented all of this. Well, I don't think ESG was ever invented to try and prevent global conflict. And nor, for that matter, did I see companies like Gazprom or Norilsk Nickel doing particularly well in ESG rankings on either the E, the E, or the E, the S, or the G. And beyond that, I'll just make a point about ESG to say, when we think about this term, ESG is really the application of environmental, social and governance filters to how a company or an investment does things. I spend a lot of my time thinking about and working there at sustainable finance, and really what we're trying to think of there is not how the companies do things, but what impacts the companies have on environmental outcomes or societal outcomes and so on, which is what we need to focus on in Russia or elsewhere. It's the impacts, not the how. But anyway, that's possibly a bit of an aside. Going back to that behaviour of managers, which was the question, Stephen. I think, and I say this with some trepidation, seeing as we have Bob Suster in the audience, who will correct me on my ethics if I get this wrong. So Bob, for those of you who don't know, for those of you online who don't know, is an extremely distinguished ethicist and teaches on the Chartered Banker MBA program, amongst many other programs. I just think we need to refer to some pretty basic and timeless ethical principles, Alex. I don't know about what's right and wrong. Whether that's Kant's golden rule, act as we would want, all other people to act towards other people themselves, and that there's that classic one about, do you want to see what you've just done on the front page of a newspaper? To take us away from Russia and Ukraine, look at P&O this week. for instance. Now, there's a great example of something that you wouldn't want to see on the front page of a newspaper with a poor decision. But of course, these individual ethical decisions need to be embedded within organizational and societal cultures where ethical principles are seen as being the professional norms. And that's where we come back to the role of the profession, and we have to educate those as the norms to begin with. And then we need to strongly enforce these, both formally, that's the role of regulation, and informally through the professions, through societal disapproval and so on like that. And clearly, I would say, maybe we'll go on to talk about this, there are some small parts of the professions in the UK, the US, and elsewhere, I would say, where what's legal has taken precedence over what's right, and that, in part, has led us to the situation we're currently in.
Thanks, Simon. Over to you, Alex.
Thank you, Stephen. Well, Simon, I commend the Chartered Bankers Institute for leading bankers not only in the UK, but around the world in the education process and getting their credentials refreshed to best serve what bankers do best, and that is to enhance the economic vitality of the communities they serve. That is the main role of a banker. A banker provides the capital that makes the economy go. I know that firsthand. I live in Florida, which is the third largest state in the United States after California and Texas. And we're growing by 900 people a day. And our banks are helping people become homeowners and business owners. And as it relates to the Russia sanctions, our bankers globally, here, everywhere, whatever country you choose to give as an example, are patriotic. They want to make sure they comply whatever the regulations are. But I can tell you firsthand that bankers are well regulated, heavily regulated, to the point where many banks have more compliance staff than lenders. And I particularly bring out an American phenomenon. It's called the community and regional bank. Not the mega banks, not the worldwide systemic global banks, but the smaller banks, which we call community banks. While they only have 20% of the market share in the banking industry in the United States, they give out 50% of small business loans of $1 million or less. And what does that mean? Well, in the United States, like most countries, small business rule and dominate. While we all love large employers and large businesses, the truth of the matter is most economies globally are based on small businesses. Some of them grow to be large employers, but it's very difficult to be a small business wannabe and go into a large systemic risk bank and get a small business loan. It's not going to happen. Very low likelihood. So what our banking managers, to Stephen's question and point, should behave like? Well, as to Simon alluded to, they're driven heavily by the regulatory environment that bankers live under each and every day to comply. Because failure to comply could mean a regulatory order or a fine of that bank. And bankers have been deputized as law enforcement officers to help the law enforcement of any country catch the quote unquote bad guy. But they're doing their best to help catch that bad person. But if they make a mistake in the process, they're fined or receive a regulatory order, which hurts the bank in the public image, because nobody wants a front page headline that says your bank in your local community just got a federal order from the national regulator. Nobody wants that. So in summary, Stephen, look, there's a lot going on in the world. Bankers want to help in the process, including now the Russia sanctions, to help to stop the money flow. Because Simon's right. Once you choke that in Russia, that's going to help bring Mr. Putin, perhaps, and we hope, to his senses, and hopefully others in Russia to perhaps remove him in the leadership role as Russia is crippled by these sanctions.
Great, thanks, Alex. It's now an opportune moment for me to plug the Chartered Banker MBA, which is delivered by Banker Business School, and our professional partner is the Chartered Banker Institute, represented by Simon here today. It's the world's only qualification that has dual recognition, an MBA, and it includes people, as Simon said, like Bob Souster, who teaches about ethics and regulation and things. So maybe we should be offering it once things settle down. We'll be offering it in Russia and help them understand what they ought to do. But the next slide, and there aren't many more before we get to, sorry, that's the one. We touched upon it slightly. The screen that the gentlemen are looking at does change as well. It talks about an educational and supervisory role for the professions. We've talked just a moment or two ago about regulation, the sledgehammer hitting them. We've talked about bankers being deputised, Alex says, to catch the bad guys. Simon talks about corporate culture and society. This slide is taken from Chartered Banker, as I've attributed it at the bottom. Their idea of the responsible banker, which is what Banker Business School, in its delivery of the Chartered Banker MBA, subscribes to. And I thought, just before we go into discussions and questions, we might just spend a moment or two perhaps on this idea of encouraging people to be responsible bankers, and when there are enough of them, the corporate culture then changes to recognise that. I will start with Simon again, so we're not going one and the other by alternation, in as much as this is the Chartered Banker Initiative, and then I know that Alex will want to say something about it as well. Simon.
Thanks, Stephen. Perhaps if I take a banking perspective, of course, you're a distinguished lawyer as well. People may not know that, so we talk about some other professions too. And, you know, when peace comes, and obviously I hope it comes very, very soon, we need to reflect, I alluded to this before, on the role that, you know, some small parts of the banking sector in the UK, the US and other countries, and internationally have played in supporting and facilitating autocratic and kleptocratic regimes, not just in Russia. There are many other examples too. You know, I think some parts of some other professions do bear greater scrutiny than many parts of banking do. Accountancy, law and tax and so on spring to mind, and the way that particularly kind of legislation, regulation, law and so on, and the perfectly legal abuse, if you see it, ethical abuse perhaps of the law, has been utilised by those who want to both use it for their own ends, but even more worryingly, to undermine the liberal values and the rule of law which they are using in the first place. Not just, you know, and stealing not just from their own citizens, but from all of us too, and ultimately it leads to the terrible things we're seeing at the moment. I mean, there's aspects to this beyond the professions. There's clearly policy, legislation, regulation, and particularly enforcement. You know, so for all the banks can do, and bankers do a great job on compliance these days. I mean, they have to, because, you know, the even put ethics aside, just commercially, I think it was Standard Chartered will find something around about £300 million for sanctions abuses with Iran and so on. These are eye-watering sums, so it just makes business sense to get this stuff right. But if the law itself and the regulation and things isn't right, then you know, we're in a very, very difficult place. So, but that doesn't absolve us in the professions of our responsibility. We have to look at ourselves and say, what can we do to educate our members better, to strengthen our ethical and professional guidance for members? What can we do to enforce this for our members with the limited powers we have, or how can we better work with regulators to do this? You know, ultimately, we have to make clear there should be no room for any individual in a profession, which is, after all, defined as a body that acts in the public interest. There should be no room for an individual who deliberately undermines the public interest using their professional expertise and skill. And then one more aspect to this too, as well. I think all professional bodies, including ourselves, need to reconsider our appetite for working not just with Russia, but similar regimes too. The argument that's always been made, and I've made it myself in many fora, is that, you know, through education, through training and so on, through building the capacity of accounting, of tax, of legal systems, of banking and so on in Russia and elsewhere, we're inculcating Western liberal values and the rule of law. I guess evidence would seem to tell us that perhaps we haven't been as successful as we thought we would be. So does that mean we need to try harder, or does that mean we need to stop? I don't know the answer to that. I wish I did.
You know, I commend Bangor University for emphasizing ethics. It's so important. The Chartered Bankers Institute, Bob, I mean, it is so important. And to the students here tonight and those listening, my advice to you is simple. You work a lifetime to create a reputation of respect with ethics, a profile that you're a person that could be trusted. And all that can be lost in a nanosecond based on one decision. But that's the way the world works. And Simon's absolutely right. Our bankers always have to strive to be a trusted advisor for their customers, to advise that family on the purchase of one of the major investments in their life, the purchase of a flat, the purchase of a home, and to advise that family on what is the best financial product for them that they can afford to sustain them in that home, not to put them in an interest-only mortgage where in a rising interest environment or when a recession comes, they're placed in a mortgage where they're going to lose the property and lose everything they've worked and strive for. So the banker has to be that trusted advisor, but it's beyond banking, as Simon says. You remember the Panama Papers when they went public? It was embarrassing. It was embarrassing that accountants and lawyers and other professions were advising people how to get around laws in all countries by creating, you know, this and this charter and that fake charter and putting monies over here versus over there. It was an embarrassment to all parties, and it all went public. And it shows you where, you know, someone's got to say no. And sometimes it's hard because it involves money. It involves money, but you have to stand tall on that because, again, you only have one opportunity to lose the respect that you've worked so hard to gain in your profession, whatever profession that is. So ethics is important, Simon. I commend you and the University of Bangor University for emphasizing that in the studies, because sometimes many do not.
Okay, thanks for that. Unless you have anything more to say, Simon, I'm going to open it up to discussion. Is there anything you want to say about how we might improve things, or should we get to some of the questions online?
I think at some point we should think about how to improve things, or we'll all go away thoroughly depressed.
No, tell us about how we're going to improve things then, Simon.
But we could do questions first.
Yeah, let's have some questions first. And there's people in the room here. You're all going to be putting your hands up, I know. I'm moving slightly out of camera. And that's mainly so that I can have a look at the questions that have been raised online, so that our online audience also feels they've had a good crack. I think building on the questions, the discussion we've just had, Rhys Owen asks, do you feel that the UK anti-money laundering regulations have failed, given the number of Russian oligarchs having UK banking assets frozen? Very specific question.
It is. Well, I'd probably better take it from the UK perspective,
yes.
but the US perspective, and see whether you think the situation is the same in the US. Well, of course, the regulations themselves probably haven't failed, because there's probably been very, very good, not 100%, but very good compliance with them. The problem is that the regulations themselves are simply not fit for purpose, and we don't enforce them. I think 4 unexplained wealth orders since they were introduced, and yet I simply refer colleagues in the room and online to the back pages of Private Eye if you want to find out what's going on. And yet it seems our regulators and legislators have been incapable of acting on the evidence that's before their eyes. You can't expect bankers to go beyond what the regulations say. So I would say, yes, the problem lies within the regulations and the enforcement of the regulations, and we need to take a thorough look at them. But more than that, the sort of the law as a whole and regulation as a whole, and how it has been used and is being used in what I think is a deliberate attempt to undermine the rule of law and the liberal democracies.
Thanks, Simon.
Stephen, in the United States, our Treasury Department has this list of bad people that our banks look at before opening up an account. And they have to file a suspicious activity report, which we call SAR, that goes to our Scotland Yard, our FBI, Federal Bureau of Investigations, and they are to examine and look into that suspicious activity report. Or it could be the son of a former dictator. It could be the daughter of a former dictator who now is trying to open up a bank account in the United States. And those people are generally on our list of those that our banks will not touch, will not open an account for. But I think generally speaking, to something Simon and I were talking before we got on stage, I think there's some self-reflection that we need to do with Russia, with the oligarchs. I think we looked at them as credible individuals who were very wealthy, and they weren't, someone, that came from a dictatorship or a brutal genocide country or some other. We kind of looked at them and said, it's okay. Maybe we need to reflect on that. Maybe the bar was too low. And we call that being a Monday morning quarterback, the Monday after the game on Sunday. But it's never too late to reflect on our rules and regulations. And maybe those oligarchs from here on out, unless the system changes in Russia and Putin's cronies stop being in existence. But I have a feeling that as long as he's in power or that system is in power, whoever succeeds Putin will have the same type of system. We need to change on how we bank them, because our laws really, they escape scrutiny under the current laws that we have, where people like that coming from a country like Russia are not treated as, again, someone from a country that committed genocide or a country that was an illegal government in existence, and they took money from the treasury. These oligarchs now have created a new way of perhaps regulating people like them that we need to address, that we failed to in the past.
If I sort of add a point there as well. So you may be aware that just a week or 10 days or so ago, we passed a sort of long overdue, or brought to the House, a new UK economic crime bill to try and overcome some of the issues around some of the existing legislation. One of the big problems in the UK, Alex, is that it's been incredibly easy to register sort of shell companies in Companies House, the register of companies here, and nobody knows who owns them and who stands behind them. It's been ridiculously easy to get around that. And so the UK economic crime bill was thought, let's close that loophole. Now, I can't take credit for this, but 2 days after the bill was brought forward, a piece appeared in The Guardian that offering advice to oligarchs if they want to find their way around that. Now, I doubt many oligarchs read The Guardian, to be fair, but which is a sort of a left of centre newspaper here in the UK. And just sort of said, look, if you want to avoid the provisions of the bill, all you have to do is to own your offshore company in equal shares of 16 2/3 with 5 close relatives. That's all you have to do to get around it. This is the problem. You don't even need to pay for expensive legal or accounting advice. Just read The Guardian, set up your company that way. That's all fine. This is not good enough. So what this leads me to think about is that I don't think the problem is so much the oligarchs. They're the public face of this. So yes, it's great. So Chelsea's going to have a new owner. If you're a Chelsea supporter, probably awful. If you're not a Chelsea supporter, this could be great for you. Makes wonderful tabloid headlines. The problem is not the oligarchs we can see. It's the foreign influence we can't see. in the political system, the legislative system, and so on. And we have to reform that. If we want to, by itself, that's not going to stop the war in Ukraine. Of course it's not. But how do we stop future wars, future things like this? We have to start with ourselves. We have to reform ourselves first.
And Stephen, I will say in closing, because I did want to get to questions and answers. I think this Russian-Ukraine exercise and this cold reality we're going through is just a prelude. And it would be a pimple on an elephant as to what we may be facing globally if President Xi of China executes on what he has publicly said many, many times, that he wants Taiwan to be part of China again. And Taiwan is an independent country. 60% of our computer chips are made in Taiwan. And what will the world look like if we wake up one morning with Chinese soldiers in Taipei? That's going to be the tough one. That's going to be the difficult one. And this is just the opening act to what the world will face if China executes on their plans.
Okay, thanks. So both there seem to want to talk about how could we change things. Perhaps it'll be a slow process for Ukraine, but to make sure these things perhaps are reduced in future. I will come to a question in a moment from the room. And in the room, there are, as I look around, both academics and students. And I'm sure the academics will be itching to ask a question, but it'd be good if the students could also have a chance. So students, start thinking of questions. Let me ask for short responses, gentlemen, to the following one. In view of Russia's alleged central role, Boyd Anthony says, in view of Russia's alleged central role in international hacking of global systems, what new considerations and mitigating actions are banks taking or should take to mitigate against retaliatory action by Russia?
I can tell you the banks in the United States have spent hundreds of millions, tens of billions of dollars to create cybersecurity secure banks because of the hacks, Stephen, potential hacks that we get from Russia and other countries like Russia. And especially our smaller institutions cannot afford a hack. If you have a $120 million little community bank and they lose $10 million, that could be the kiss of death for that little community institution if that occurs to a hack. So our banks have spent a lot of money to try to protect against that, but it's a journey, not a destination. It's a never-ending process because it seems like the bad people are creating new ways to get into those walls of banks to hack financial systems in the United States and around the world, Stephen.
Yeah. Simon, any thoughts?
Well, I think very similar in the UK. I mean, UK banks are being attacked all the time, 24 hours a day by a wide variety of actors. Clearly, there hasn't been a major successful attack for a while. It doesn't mean there won't be one, but I would imagine, I'm certain the UK vulnerabilities are not so much in the banking system, they're elsewhere.
Including in the politicians' phone systems, where allegedly a number of UK politicians have had phone calls from imposters in Russia. Now, I'll take a question there from the gentleman with glasses in the middle, and I'll repeat the question in case you can't hear it online.
Yes, I was just interested whether you think that sanctions ever be successful without cooperation with China, access to quick alternatives.
Okay, if I may just repeat the question. So the question regards whether or not sanctions will ever be completely successful without bringing China on board, because China runs some parallel systems to the SWIFT system for payment that we've just been hearing about a little earlier in the presentation.
I think that when you look at the global top 50 banks in the world, The UK has 4. The United States has 4 traditional banks. China has 14 on that list, including the top 5. But the Chinese banks don't have the strength of banks like, you know, in the UK and the US, Canada, and other countries. I think for these sanctions to work, to answer your question now, we do need the cooperation of China. We've gotten mixed signals from President Xi. They seem to be sensitive to the media and to global reports. I don't think they want to be on the losing side of this. So they want to pick the winning horse in the race. And, you know, so PR-wise, they're very sensitive to criticism. But yes, we all know about Mr. Putin's meeting with President Xi during the Olympics and the promises and the discussions made from press reports, at least some of those. And President Xi, I think, has supported and I think asked Mr. Putin to attack after the Olympics ended, so not rein in on his parade during the Winter Olympics. But China is going to have to get on board, at least stay neutral. But I don't think their financial system, including their SWIFT model, is strong enough to sustain Russia from being totally closed out by Europe, the United States, Canada, and the rest of the world. I don't think China's financial system can sustain Russia if the rest of the world holds true and firm.
And if I could maybe,
Yes,
there's time to add a different perspective to it as well. So I'm not, well, I have a suspicion that this is more about the long-term geopolitical balance between the US and China. And actually what's happened here is that Putin has rather foolishly allowed himself to become China's pawn in this game, which is not a comfortable place for a Russian leader to be. I mean, in Russian history, Russia's always been tempted, is it a Western power, is it an Asiatic power? It's always tended to want to move to the West. And if you look at St. Petersburg, Moscow, and so on, they are Western cities and so on. You know, it's partly a long-term competition between China and the US for resources. You know, remember, both Ukraine and Russia, very resource-rich, very commodity-rich countries. But it's partly a proxy war, I think, we're in now for liberal democratic values versus autocracy. And you know, Ukraine is the first domino. A successful democratic Ukraine that aligns to the West is a threat to Putin. The last thing he wants is a successful democratic state, you know, Slavic state on his borders. If Ukraine demonstrates that, maybe Russia's next. If Russia's next, what does China lose? China loses resources, it loses a large landmass and so on, and you've then got a much larger bloc. So I think in a funny sort of way, though not directly, these sanctions are sort of targeted towards China as well. It's partly a warning and it's partly long term, and I hope our leaders are looking at this in a very long-term statesman-like sort of manner. I think part term for me, this is about kind of saying, right, which side is Russia going to be on in this? And Putin, despite this image of him being this cold, calculating genius, I think he's allowed himself to become a pawn in a much bigger game.
Okay, now I'm going to divulge that those of us who are in the room in Bangor can continue these discussions over only light refreshments, I have to say, soft drinks after. But so I am going to turn to those who will not be able to join us because they're online. But there's a question there, the lady with the hat on.
Yes.
Okay, thanks for that clarification. So less a question, more a point of clarification, just so that everybody's heard it. As I said, when we have these events, one has no idea what the speakers are going to say, and of course that applies to anybody, but thanks for your contribution. So the view was, returning to the point that was made about Taiwan and China, the point was being made of the connections politically that already exist, and the relationship between Taiwan and China was the point that was being made by the speaker, that already exist and are therefore not necessarily for discussion. There was somebody else who had a question there, the lady there, yeah. Okay, the question is what sanctions other than financial sanctions might be possible. Simon earlier on in setting his stall out talked about this is the economic sanctions are rather more like economic warfare, but the question is to what extent there are sanctions other than economic that we might be able to use. Any thoughts, Simon, first?
Well, I think Alex, when you had quite a good list in answer to the first question, really, of some of the sort of technology sanctions and so on, and that's really the other area. Again, I made the point earlier about for me, I think the sanctions against the oligarchs are very much for the newspapers and for a good story. But yeah, you talked about airline parts and
Sure. And I think that's going to cripple the Russian economy, and certainly, again, the everyday Russian people, the ones who are going to suffer when, by 2021, imports accounted for 75% of sales in Russia of non-food consumer goods. That's a lot of imports that Russia depends on. 86% of their telecommunications came from overseas. So if you cut that out, how is Russia going to maintain their system? Their airlines are based on Boeing and Airbus airplanes and parts. So if you cut that out, how is Russia going to sustain their airline industry, which, as you know, is important to any country for commerce, for movement of people, and that's going to suffer. Even the Russian truck company KAMAZ relies on foreign parts. And they're estimating that 40% of production in that factory that employs tens of thousands of Russians will suffer. So now where Russia can come back, unless the world can generate production of this particular product, ammonium nitrate, for most of us, it doesn't matter. We say, what is that? Well, that's a ingredient used to create fertilizer that farmers use around the world to help the crop production. Russia happens to have a 2/3 majority and foothold in the worldwide market on ammonium nitrate. So unless other countries can produce that, they may not be able to produce fertilizer, which is ingredient for food production. So that's a feather that Mr. Putin has in his cap, as we say. So they can retaliate there, unless, again, production of that can be made elsewhere to make up for the loss of the Russian market. So, but again, bottom line, as we talked earlier, it's going to take not only financial, but other types of sanctions to work, and it's going to take all countries globally, or at least most countries, for them to work in this instance.
I'm going to take a question from the chat area. We are quite happy to go beyond the 1 hour when we have topics to talk about. Jaden Tulip says, do you think Western companies, including banks, are going to be able to adapt and survive to the losses caused by sanctions? And so that's bringing it back to companies outside Russia. As we said earlier, the Woodrow Wilson view that it was a silent tool and needed no force perhaps hasn't been proven to be the case since 1919 when he said it. Can Western companies, including banks, be able to adapt and survive, Simon?
Yes, very few companies have made. I mean, clearly there are some companies who base their entire business on working with Russia, but there's a very small minority. I think there's really nothing to be worried about at all in terms of the banks. UK banks have very limited exposure to Russia. A couple of European lenders, I think UniCredit was mentioned earlier, Raiffeisen and so on, have subsidiaries in Russia. It's not I think it's still less than 10% of their overall business. Since 2014 and the first sanctions in Crimea, most European and all European and UK lenders have significantly reduced exposures. So I think when the ECB and other regulators have looked at this from a European perspective, there's no capital implications on the banks. In effect, what we'll see is shareholders taking a little bit of pain for a few years, so reduced dividends, despite what UniCredit say. And again, as I mentioned earlier, the great majority of Western businesses, in terms of sales revenue, perhaps don't have a major component in Russia or the region. I think where it will hit is in terms of the complexities of some of the global supply chains, though. And so you can see that Volkswagen, for instance, had to stop production in some factories in Germany because some of the wiring bundles it needs are produced in Ukraine. I think others might be produced in Russia and it can't get access to any of them. So there'll be these sort of complex bits, and there'll be lots of running around looking for alternative sources of supply. So there'll be short-term disruption, but it's not going to be a major hit. You know, remember, Russia is a vast, huge, and in many ways great country, but economically it is not a powerhouse anymore, except in that very important area of oil and gas.
Stephen, for U.S. banks, I mirror what Simon said. U.S. banks have, they don't have substantial holdings in Russia, and so divesting from Russia will not cause any turbulence in the United States banking system. Stephen.
Okay, so Adrian Nelson says Russia's accused the UK of sanctions hysteria in its support of Ukraine and has threatened retaliatory actions against the West as a result. Given what we've just heard from Simon about Russia not being a significant economic powerhouse, we may actually say there's relatively little other than the supply chain, and there's been the double whammy effect of the supply challenges caused due to COVID and bringing materials from Asia and things. Are we hysterical, Simon, in the UK? Sanctions hysteria?
No, absolutely not. The hysteria is firmly in the Kremlin when they decide to invade, to bomb, and to shell cities. That's where the hysteria lies.
Right. Short but sharp answer. We must be getting ready for the refreshments. But before we get to that one, and it'll draw our discussion to a close. Thanks for those people in the room who've been willing to ask questions. I know there are more of you over the soft drinks, and thanks for those of you online. Perhaps to return as a closing point before I ask for a vote of thanks, picking up on Simon's point about coming back about how we're going to change things in the future. Seboka Mosime has a question here that says sanctions generally impact the layman and not the despot, which echoes what Simon's been saying. And it goes on to say, further, once the war is over, how do you reintegrate the global economy back to some semblance of balance to ensure that the Ukraine and by extension Russia are functional economies in support of the layman, or the lay person, I should say, in their own countries? What can we do along those lines? And please feel free to extend to that question that you raised a little earlier, Simon, which was about, let's not all go to our soft drinks feeling depressed. What can we do about it?
You know, let's be clear. No country, without it receiving some adverse military action. I am a military veteran, but I don't proclaim to be a military expert. But no country in the 21st century should have to go through what Ukraine is going through right now. It's an independent country, and you can talk about whatever you want to say historically about a country, but no country in the rest of the world should not tolerate what is happening in Ukraine today. So the rest of the world has two decisions to make: the start of World War III or global sanctions. And those are the only two roads. And one of our presidents, William Jefferson Clinton, had a saying that it's all about the economy. And he had one last word that I won't repeat on that phrase, but it was all about the economy. The economy is important. And Russia's got to be sent a message that their behavior, and it would be true of any country invading another one that hasn't been militarily hit on, no matter what your claims are totally unacceptable in the 21st century. And I think that's the message that Mr. Putin is getting, Stephen, and he needs to continue to get. And other people like Mr. Putin, more importantly, need to see what is happening to Russia. And maybe they need to think about, if I do the same, what will happen to my country globally?
Simon, send us forth with a smile on our face and some hope that there's a way out of it other than just warfare, economic or other.
Yeah, well, the question was about how do we get back to a more globalized world? Wasn't it? And I wonder if look at history. So globalization kind of comes and goes in waves. So at some point we do get back to it. But what can we actually do? Well, rather than worrying about what countries or organizations do, let's think about what we can do as individuals. And I'm always struck by the famous John Wesley quote here about, just do all the good you can in as many ways as you can to help as many people as you can for as long as you ever can. So let's focus on the global humanitarian response right now. And then once peace comes, and let's hope it comes very soon, then let's offer at least a conditional olive branch to the Russian civilian population, who will sadly suffer many, many years for what is Putin's folly. I doubt he cares about that, but let's show that we care about that and about them. And that's not just on a humanitarian basis, it's in our enlightened self-interest too, I think. We only have one world. There is no planet B, as is used in another context as well. But also, let's remember too that in the long term, as Thomas Jefferson said, the price of freedom is eternal vigilance. Mm-hmm. And we need, I think, to understand that we're in a way victims of a long-term campaign to undermine liberal democracy, creating internal conflict, sort of focusing on conflict within rather than conflict without. So let's focus a little bit on ourselves and reform our political system, our legal system, our regulatory system, the role of the professions, and so on. Let's take the first steps within ourselves, reform ourselves, and let's do what we can to help those in Ukraine and those in Russia and those victims of many conflicts around the world that we haven't touched on tonight, that for whatever reason haven't touched our consciences, but Yemen, Syria, for instance, would be two obvious examples. And let's try and build a better world we can all be proud of.
Stephen, I want to add one other thing. Let's say there was a peace treaty tonight, which would make us all very happy, between Russia and Ukraine. And the status quo continued, Ukraine as an independent country, Russia obviously as a country. I'm not sure how you put the genie back in the bottle, Stephen, to Mr. Putin's behavior. Yes, there'll be reconciliation, but there would have to be significant behavioral changes from Mr. Putin, notwithstanding his interests in energy. Because I just don't know how countries will be able to deal, Western liberal democracies, as Simon said, would have to deal with Mr. Putin just for the selfish interests of energy. He would have to change his behavior significantly. I remember seeing a picture in an article of Mr. Putin in London talking to Prime Minister Tony Blair in 1999, a young Mr. Putin. talking about bringing in businesses and jobs to Russia and investment to Russia. That image has been destroyed. I'm not sure you can put that image back in the bottle. And I'm not sure Mr. Putin can. Perhaps a new, young, generational change in leadership in Russia can, by coming to London and Paris and New Delhi and Buenos Aires and countries around the world and saying, there's a new day dawning in Russia and I'm here to make those changes. But if it's Mr. Putin, it's going to be really, really tough.
There we are. I think that's an uplifting end from both speakers. In case you're curious as to who John Wesley is, he's the founder of Methodism, a discipline, a religious discipline. I'm now going to ask John Williams, Professor of Banking, to come up and say a few words by way of thanks.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. Well, it's my privilege to have been asked to give this vote of thanks this evening. To begin with, I'd like to thank our audience, both here in Bangor and, of course, online across the world. Thank you very much for attending our event this evening. It has been our pleasure, our privilege to host this public lecture on such an important topic. Please join me in thanking our distinguished speakers for their thoughtful and insightful discourse. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Alex Sanchez and Simon Thompson. Thank you both. Lastly, as Stephen has hinted, I'd like to remind everybody in the room that you can join us for refreshments which are now being served downstairs on level 2. So thank you once again, gentlemen, a most entertaining and insightful evening. Thank you very much, guys.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
There we are. Those in the room, level 2 beckons. But first of all, thanks to everybody. And